Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. In our last episode, we looked at reports from different people who said there is a secret facility buried deep beneath the town of Dulce, New Mexico. However, we left out the testimony of one man who claimed he was the only survivor of a war that happened under the mesa. This man is arguably the most controversial person in the claims about the possible existence of Dulce Airbase. After taking cover behind a large piece of equipment, the lieutenant tried to figure out what was going on. At least 3 people in his platoon were dead, their bodies so badly burned that they could not be identified. This was because their enemies were using terrible weapons. Even so, they had done what they were told and pushed the enemy deeper into the facility. If they could just secure the stairwell in front of them, the mission would be a success. 2 more of his team members were hiding behind another crate across the corridor. He started giving a number of orders by making hand gestures. Moments later, they got up and walked toward the looming metal door, each holding a satchel charged tightly. They knew what they wanted to do, but before they could get there, the door suddenly opened wide. From the darkness inside, a skeleton-like figure appeared, and then its weapon let out a terrifying burst of bright blue energy. The 2 soldiers didn't even have time to scream before a ball of bright blue flame engulfed their bodies. Almost right away, an infantryman farther down the hallway with the platoon's heavy machine gun, the M60, opened fire on the attacker, destroying him with a steady stream of gunfire. Then, more soldiers ran forward and picked up the dropped satchel charges, primed them, and threw them through the open doorway. There was a huge explosion, which was followed by a huge cloud of dust and debris as the stairwell collapsed. This meant that their enemy couldn't get to this floor or any other floors above them. 2 of his men were left to cover the wreckage. The lieutenant and the rest of his platoon made their way back up through the facility to the main loading area. But when he got there, he was shocked to see that 2 more army trucks had pulled up and let out more soldiers in black uniforms. These soldiers rushed towards the corridors where he and his men had just come out. He turned quickly to his commanding officer and asked what was going on, who this unit was, and why they were now going underground to the lower levels. He was quickly told not to worry about it. He and the other Navy SEALs could only watch as the unknown soldiers kept going deeper into the base where so many US soldiers were. Soldiers had already died trying to stop the marauding alien threat. During the summer of 1995, Phil Schneider gave a series of talks all over the United States. In each one, he stressed the dangers of what he was doing as much as he could. He talked about how his close friend had been killed and made to look like he had killed himself. Then he talked about different attempts on his own life and threats to hurt his family that were made to stop him from telling the public secret military information. But Schneider said that his love for his country was more important than his own safety, and that the people of the United States had a right to know about the possible dangers that their government was hiding from them. He would start his talks by saying that he came from a family of people who worked for the government. How his father worked on the Manhattan Project as a military officer. Then he would show everyone the fingers that were missing from his left hand and say that he had lost them while fighting extraterrestrial attackers to take back control of a secret military installation. Schneider would show strange-looking metals and minerals and say that they were the results of experiments that the American people had not been told about. He would then go into great detail about how, under the surface of North America, there was a huge network of underground military bases connected by miles and miles of magnetic train tracks. At the end of his talks, he would say that when it was his time to die, just like with his friend, his murder would be made to look like a suicide, even though he did not want to die. The passionate public speaker would be found dead in his apartment less than a year later. His death was ruled a suicide, which may not have been a surprise to anyone who had heard him speak. Phil Schneider told anyone who would listen, just like the former Air Force Sergeant Thomas Costello did before him, that the Archuleta Mesa was hiding a military base. But unlike the mysterious Costello, Schneider chose to give his evidence in a much more public way. He spoke openly to a room full of people who were interested in his story and answered any questions they had about it. He talked about how the US government had been building a huge network of underground bases all over the country since the end of World War II. Schneider said that, as far as he knew, there were 129 deep underground military bases or DUMBs hidden beneath the plains, mountains, and valleys of North America. Near the famous Area 51 testing facility in Nevada, 9 of these were found close to each other in and around Groom Lake. All of these bases were connected by a seemingly endless network of tunnels with a maglev train line that allowed workers to move between them, at speeds of up to Mach 2. As Schneider stood and talked about how these tunnels had been built and how each of the secret bases had been built, the audience was clearly impressed by the level of technical details he used. The maglev tunnels weren't dug or blasted into the ground. Instead, each base was made with laser technology that melted and vitrified its way through the previously impenetrable rock. Deep holes were drilled into the ground in 4 places. Then, each floor was blasted out of the rock and connected to one of the 4 huge corner shafts. In the late 1970s, Phil Schneider was helping build a facility in New Mexico. He had no idea that he was taking part in what would become known as the Dulce. Schneider said that work on the Dulce base started to get behind schedule in August 1979 because of problems with drilling one of the corner columns. This was because of the war. The facility was being dug out through a tunnel under the southwest corner of the Archuleta Mesa. However, every time the drilling team tried to go deeper, their equipment mysteriously broke down. Schneider and the Green Beret bodyguard were lowered by a crane into the unfinished shaft to find out what was going wrong with the drilling. But as soon as he got out of the crane basket, and into what looked like a cave network that was already there, he knew right away that there was something very wrong. There was a strange and unpleasant smell in the air because the drilling operation had let old gases escape from the void below. There was also a mysterious and sooty residue on the walls of the caves, which were otherwise smooth. At this point, a tall, thin, grey figure stepped out of the shadows in front of him carrying what looked like a weapon of some kind. He was completely scared by this creature's otherworldly and scary look. Schneider killed it with his sidearm, but then 2 more came out of the darkness behind him. Backing up to the crane basket and shooting wildly, the engineer killed one of the 2, but the other then used its own weapon on him. In retaliation, Schneider was instantly engulfed by a creepy blue light, and felt a huge shock of electricity go through his body, sending him crashing to the cave floor. When he woke up, the Green Beret was putting him in the crane basket. The Green Beret then turned and fought other creatures while the basket started to rise without him. When Schneider got back to the surface, the doctors who took care of him found that his left hand and foot were badly hurt, with several fingers and toes missing. After he told his bosses what had happened, he was taken off the project. However, he later found out that construction had kept going even though he had been there. For the next year, it was said that US troops fought more battles under the Mesa. Aliens who were trying to stop the building of the base came into conflict with special forces. Schneider says that 66 soldiers and a large number of aliens died before the 2 sides were finally able to make a peace that wasn't very good. He went on to say that the aliens who had been living under the Mesa had been working with humans ever since and had made many scientific discoveries that had helped people. Schneider continued to tour the United States in 1995, giving talks in which he talked about deep underground military bases and a number of other alleged conspiracies. During these lectures, though, it became clear that the former engineer was having trouble keeping up with what he had started. He talked about how he had fought with federal agents and killed one of them in self-defense. He also said that someone had tried to kidnap his daughter to get him to stop giving lectures. Then, 2 months after his last speech in Denver, in January 1996, federal agents showed up at the home of Schneider's ex-wife Cynthia and told her that Phil had been found dead in his apartment in Wilsonville. After it seemed like Schneider had decided to kill himself, the agents searched Cynthia's house and took any notes or materials related to Phil and his lectures. They then left. The circumstances of Schneider's death have always raised questions about how quickly the authorities decided he had killed himself. Phil's body was found between his bed and wheelchair. A rubber catheter hose had been wrapped around his neck 3 times and tied off with a knot. Both of his feet were stuck firmly under the bed, and his head was resting in the wheelchair seat at an angle that didn't look natural or easy for him to reach. There were traces of blood on the floor near the body, but there were no cuts or wounds on the body that could have caused this. When the family later asked if a suicide note had been found, they were told that all the papers taken from the address had mysteriously disappeared from a police storage facility. Requests for more toxicology tests on Schneider's body were turned down because they would be too expensive, and the cause of death had already been found. More insistent requests for these tests would also be turned down because the lab that was holding the samples seems to have destroyed them. One detective who talked to Schneider's family later said that Schneider would have had a hard time tying off the catheter on his own because he was missing fingers on his left hand. When the officer in question told his bosses about his concerns, he was told to keep his thoughts to himself. He was then sent to work on a different case. Even after he had died, it seemed like Phil Schneider was still making people in power feel uncomfortable and awkward. When put in the context of all the other stories about a possible underground base at Dulce, Phil Schneider's testimony seems to make a lot of sense. Many of the experimental compounds and building methods he talked about in his lectures were just ideas at the end of the 20th century, but they are now used all the time in building work. His descriptions of the base layout and how each of the 7 levels worked were also eerily similar to those given by other witnesses, who he had never met or worked with. But even a little bit of scrutiny has shown that his stories are full of lies and mistakes, which makes it hard to take some of what he says seriously. He said over and over that Otto was his father. Oskar Schneider was the captain of a German U-boat. He was caught by the US Navy, but then he turned against the Nazis. But a quick look through German and American war records shows that this seems to be made up by Otto. Having been born in January 1906 in San Francisco. In the same way, his claims that a tactical nuclear weapon was used in the first attack on the World Trade Center and that chemical weapons were used to kill the people at Waco Ranch have been shown to be false. From what we know now, it seems like Phil Schneider was a person who liked to exaggerate and sometimes came close to being crazy. But if this was true, where did he get the injuries that changed his life? What happened to the samples and notes he was supposed to bring to his lectures but didn't? Why is there so much evidence that unknown people killed him and tried to make it look like he killed himself? Schneider's opponents say that he was not a well man and that he just used the supposed testimony of Thomas Costello to make up a crazy story about his own past, but to his supporters. The holes in his story are explained by the fact that the US The government changed Schneider's family history in a way that was meant to hurt his credibility and keep people from looking at the Dulce base. They say that the same things were done to Bob Lazar to get him kicked out of college and fired from his job. As a good example of how far the US With the rise of the internet, the government will do anything to hide such news. Every year, a little bit more information about secret military projects makes its way into the public domain. So, It is possible that, at some point in the future, evidence will finally show that there are deep underground military bases, or that technological advances will allow investigators to finally disprove the existence of such facilities. This time for good. At least for now, it looks like there is a lot more digging to be done.